sequels have you personally asked for? That's not to say that there aren't good sequels, but as countless videos on the internet have already pointed out, it's getting out of hand. And I'm blaming Disney. The past decade of the MCU films and Star Wars and its conveyor belt of Skywalker adjacent stories has empowered what feels like virtually every other property to also pursue a multi-part franchise for its studio. And sure, the horror and action genre have deep roots in seemingly endless sequels from book adaptations and different timelines within a franchise, but this hasn't always been the case for the rest of film. We're at the point to where any movie, regardless of how it ended or when it ended, it's in line to get a sequel. There's an upcoming sequel to the live-action Aladdin, a Chronicle sequel, a Spinal Tap sequel, a Face Off sequel, a live-action Mufasa prequel, and Chicken Little 2. Again, I'm missing the people who asked for the sky to fall a second time. A sequel to 1996's Twister is being made. Name me one person from the original cast, just one. All the ones I can name, respectfully, have literally passed away. I don't feel like I need to spend a lot of time explaining why I don't really care for sequels as a concept, because in practice, some of my favorite films happen to be sequels. And maybe my opinions on its conceptual validity shouldn't matter if I ultimately like them. But even with my love for those movies, it doesn't mean that I think they were necessary or even narratively justified, which is a standard that's important to me as a writer. With a number of exceptions over the years, it wasn't until more recently that sequels became more widely a part of the original film's planning process, where new properties aren't even greenlit unless they pitch a world expansion opportunity or at the very least a 5-year plan to franchise. Some of the most revered sequels were afterthoughts. Lucas had no intention of making Empire. Alien more or less resolves itself in the final moments of the film just to swap genres with a new director a few years later. But let's be real. Most sequels are no Empire or Aliens. And while I'm cutting slack, I also don't think it's the fault of the creative team behind a sequel. I think the modern era's indie horror films and dramas goes to show that this myth of Hollywood creatives being out of ideas so they just keep franchising things isn't exactly the case. Modern day writers and directors aren't the people pitching sequels to films or franchises that ended 40 years ago. Studios are. But oftentimes these creatives, regardless of their conviction to original storytelling, they find themselves having to direct a sequel at one point in their career. And I don't envy anyone that's tasked with making a follow-up or a sequel to a famed trilogy. And sometimes you're not even the original director or writer, but you're still expected to revitalize and contribute to a widely recognized property that's been happily dormant for the past however many years. And it's even worse if the ending of that last film was actually pretty well received by fans. At this point, you're grave robbing. Like, just leave it alone, let it rest. It's an uphill battle. Play it too close to the original and it's a heartless carbon copy of the first movie. Stray too far and it runs the risk of retconning and ruining the reputation of the original. There's so many ways it can go wrong. So let's count them all. No, but I am interested in understanding how to navigate a sequel with integrity, which is subjective, but I do think with the sample size of sequels that we have to look at, film history has proven that there is a right way to do an unnecessary sequel and an absolutely awful way to do an unnecessary sequel. So, in this climate that almost necessitates a follow-up film, how can you achieve critical acclaim, box office success, while also making a valuable narrative contribution to an already fulfilling and impactful story? There is no rulebook to making a sequel. Until today. It may be a few scenes in Scream 2, but today! As a note, I am expanding the definition of a sequel a bit. I'm not only talking about direct sequels that follow up films, I'm also including the decades delayed sequel. So this includes the 4th installment of films that follow up a trilogy from years ago, or sometimes a direct sequel that came decades later. I think these types of films also face a similar pressure and weight to live up to the original that's difficult to navigate, and I want to talk about it here. Today, we're diving into the do's and don'ts of making a sequel, because at this point, you'll probably end up having to make one yourself eventually. This one is a personal enemy of mine, and it tends to overlap with the decades delayed sequel because a lot of its power rests in seeing the original cast come back together. The film usually basks in familiar jokes and the glory of the original. If there's a considerable amount of time between the first film and this sequel, the film typically justifies its existence by saying so-and-so now has a kid, or remember they have a family member, and that makes this story worth revisiting. The Forced Reunion sequel, by almost all accounts, has absolutely no narrative merit, which is a completely arbitrary term I made up, so let me explain. Similar to literary merit, narrative merit basically means this new story is compatible with the original in a way that serves a larger purpose outside of just providing a life update for these characters. To have narrative merit means that this new story either critically enhances or challenges the themes, questions, or just the larger narrative presented in the original story. I mean in a way that builds off of the original to present a distinctive and new set of challenges to your characters that effectively recontextualizes or enhances the original story that people loved. The best way I can describe this is, imagine you're an Italian plumber and your goal is to save a captured princess. Actually, you don't have to do that. Just imagine you're playing Super Mario Brothers. You just finished the underwater level, you're moving on to the next stage, and as soon as you get there, you see it's just another underwater level. That sucks. It's so much more fun when new levels challenge you in different ways. What worked for the underwater level won't work for Lava World, but figuring out how to get through it is a part of the fun. Imagine if the next level was just Luigi underwater with a cameo from Mario. For the next installment, you have to give me something new. Having narrative merit in your sequel doesn't automatically mean that the story needed to continue after the first film. We didn't need a sequel to The Godfather. Let me finish. We knew what it meant when Michael Corleone closed the door on Diane Keaton. But to depict Michael Corleone's fall from grace juxtaposed to his father's descent into being the heartless and calculated leader of the family, while present-day Michael answers to the law for the countless crimes he's committed as the new head of this crime family, the context and story added in the sequel just adds to my enjoyment to the first movie. We get to see just how much Michael Corleone has changed from that opening wedding scene in the first film. To be fair, narrative merit isn't always needed to have an entertaining sequel, but for the Forced Reunion sequel to have already so little going for it, it should at the very least enhance the film that it's milking for nostalgia. Where the original film posed an interesting and compelling plot, the Forced Reunion sequel typically has a really forced or unnatural conflict that ultimately leads it into just repeating the events of the first film. This goes on to basically show that the original cast didn't really learn much the first time around and completely undermines the lessons and character arcs that we saw in the first film. The last thing that I'll mention that I think complicates the Forced Reunion sequel is that it has a limited time to do a lot. You have to not only convince audiences that this is a new story, where it clearly is not one, while also giving a reason to revisit the original characters, while also developing a new cast that we have no reference or connection to. I'm talking a lot about what goes wrong, but I think a Forced Reunion sequel that does it right is Top Gun Maverick. It has the nostalgia, it has its original characters, but also it challenges the original film's themes while also leaving space for new characters to shine and carry a new story. The Self-indulgent REWIND sequel is one that I have a love-hate relationship with. And just to be clear, these types of sequels aren't mutually exclusive. A Forced Reunion sequel can definitely be a self-indulgent rewind, and you'll likely see that throughout this video. These films are unashamed repeats of the first films. The Hangover trilogy, 21 Jump Street sequels, the Die Hard sequels. My observation is that this type of sequel tends to lean towards the action and comedy genre. It's your favorite characters back again in the exact same situation as last time. I feel like the lack of serious within the comedy genre and the assumed immortality of your characters in an action film allows you to accept these repeated plot lines. That's an ability that the the drama genre just can't really pull off. You can't do a self-indulgent rewind of The Truman Show without undermining the entire point of the movie. There's a certain finality to dramas that I think make it less amenable to a rewind sequel. Like, would you watch a Marriage Story 2? I wouldn't. I barely wanted to watch the first one, if we're being honest. Action movies and comedies are far more forgiving of recycled plot lines. But even for the action genre, I'd say this type of sequel has mixed results. Mostly because there are some premises I can only buy once. For instance, the original Jurassic Park's Ian Malcolm was such a fun character to have in the original because he was a stand-in for the skeptics in the audience, expressing early on how playing God by reanimating dinosaurs will always come back to bite you in the ass. He serves as an in-film narrator, conscious of the danger that we see as audience members. This is contrasted to the other film's characters who kind of balance out his pessimism throughout the film. And by the end, we see that maybe we should have listened to the womanizing know-it-all scientist. His realistic criticism of the park is why he's a fan favorite. So to have the next movie make Ian Malcolm, of all people, have a cheap-ass excuse to be the only person that returns to the park in the sequel, it undermines everything we thought we knew about him from the first film. I thought he was smarter than that. Lost World does make attempts to add depth to this character in other ways, and Jeff Goldblum is never not great. But I think this character was mostly stunted because they attempted to take their sarcastic comedic relief character and turn him into the leading man in the sequel. This sequel ultimately fails at building this character in a way that acknowledges and honors the reason he was even a fan favorite in the first movie. Comedies aren't safe either. Even Soundtrack of the Century, Shrek 2, is a questionable addition to the first film. Yes, I love how Far, Far Away parodies Hollywood and expands the world of Shrek. I would personally pay DreamWorks to make that city at the bottom of that Far, Far Away castle into an amusement park. But Shrek 2's plot basically undermines everything we thought Shrek learned about self-acceptance in the first film. It almost beat for beat reuses the exact same plot of feeling inadequate as an ogre in his relationship with Princess Fiona. If he's facing the exact same challenges as the original film, believing that Princess Fiona would be better off with a handsome prince instead of an ogre, but now it's in a new location and from a different source, what really came of the first film? This is also an issue that the Doctor Strange sequel faced when introducing Scarlet Witch as its child-seeking villain after a series-long arc in WandaVision where she destroyed everything and killed in pursuit of her children. It's not that I'm unconvinced that these plot lines could be interesting twice. Trainspotting 2, I think, is a really great example of a film that's able to revisit themes and questions and challenges from the first film, but from a new perspective as an interesting commentary on addiction and the company you keep. I just think instead of using the original as a manual that you need to faithfully imitate step by step, it should instead be a framework that you reference as you look for opportunities to elevate the world of the original and pose distinctive new challenges to your characters. There isn't a lot of narrative or creative merit if you're just saying, we're the first thing again, but with more jokes and more explosions. While I'm trashing this kind of sequel, one of my favorite movies is a self-indulgent rewind sequel. And that's, of course, Cinderella 3, A Twist in Time, baby! This movie travels back to the events of that iconic, original, boring as hell 1950s movie and makes it worth conversation, okay? We get redemption for former villains, a girl boss Cinderella, a horror sequence to where the pumpkin she's traveling in starts decaying and she almost falls off of a cliff. The movie builds off of the timeless story that we know and changes it to be even more gripping and defining for one of the most boringest Disney princesses. This sequel builds its original characters in a way that most Disney direct-to-DVD sequels don't, and I would know. I've seen them all. The villain is even scarier and more powerful than she was in the original, and they further complicate things for our main character by removing her biggest asset from the original film. It's a perfect example of how a sequel that largely utilizes the original can still elevate the story in a way that provides an entirely new, dare I say, more interesting story to tell. While with absolutely no irony, I seriously love Cinderella 3, A Twist in Time. Let's actually go back to talking about what I was going to say, which is arguably the greatest sequel of all time. Back to the Future 2. This film, by all accounts, is a self-indulgent rewind. The first half is an incredibly lazy, nostalgia-driven, shot-for-shot recreation of the first film, swelling the classic theme music where it needs to be, and making endless pop culture references for audience enjoyment. Until the unexpectedly dark midpoint of the movie. This is where the story we originally knew completely gets flipped upside down as a consequence of the film's central narrative device being time travel. Sure, this film uses the plot of a consequence of time travel just as the original did, but for the second and third act, it's an entirely different story from the first one. In the first film, we saw how even the slightest bit of tampering jeopardized Marty, his family, and his future, but him and Doc successfully escaped, incidentally improving the lives of everyone around Marty. While he innocently interfered with time travel in the first film, the second film shows Marty kind of getting cocky and trying to use time travel to his advantage. While the first film threatened his and his siblings' existence, the second film shows that his tampering has consequences for not only him and Doc, but all of Hill Valley. It's everything a sequel should be. Everything you love about the original, but the stakes are raised. I know I just shit on Shrek 2 for copying the exact same plotline and lesson of its original film, but let me just clarify, I love Shrek 2. But what differentiates Back to the Future 2 as a sequel from Shrek 2 as a sequel is that Shrek 2 just replaces the villains from Shrek 1 with new characters, but they basically have the same motivation, and then poses it as a new story with a new lesson to learn. Farquaad wants Fiona for himself, and the fairy godmother wants Fiona for her son, and Fiona's parents agree. But like C3, A Twist in Time, Back to the Future 2 uses the framework of the first film to recontextualize its villain as an even scarier and more powerful threat than the first time around. Biff is genuinely scary in Back to the Future 2. And while the second and third act literally revisit the second and third act of the first film, they're two entirely different movies. Sure, I'd say the fairy godmother is a step up from Lord Farquaad, but Shrek essentially has to learn the same lesson he learned to beat Farquaad to beat her. Furthermore, the time travel lessons that Marty learns from Back to the Future aren't negated by him repeating those actions in the second film. If anything, the success of him and Doc from the first film is probably what made him feel so confident with blatantly fucking with time travel in the second movie. He thinks he's got it all figured out and that he can use time travel to his advantage. And fortunately for us, he can't, and we get one of the best sequels of all time, reiterating the main theme of being happy with what you have and not to fuck with time travel. It's also not beyond me that the two examples I use to basically excuse the Self-indulgent Rewind sequel are two films that literally use time travel to revisit the events of the first film. That wasn't intentional, but maybe to some degree, I just don't think it's interesting to copy your original unless it's blatantly using the original film as a cool and interesting plot device to build upon for the sequel. Another time the sun's gone down on me. Alright friends, lastly, genre sequels. Genre sequels are another hit or miss for me personally. And if you know me, you know what the hits and misses are. I'm an unashamed apologist for horror sequels. The first installment of a horror franchise is often the most grounded and accessible. One Halloween night goes haywire, there's nightmares on Elm Street, a sleepaway camp is stalked by a murderer. But the sequel? That's where the risk is. In horror sequels, whether they're good or bad, they always turn it up a notch, okay? One bad Halloween night turns into a hypnotic Halloween commercial for a Halloween mask activates a death trap that will mass murder children on Halloween night. A Nightmare on Elm Street becomes the real-life original cast of the first Nightmare on Elm Street films become targeted by fictional Freddy Krueger, and their real world is sucked into another Nightmare on Elm Street sequel. And Jason goes to space. I can't lie, I'm not really a Friday the 13th kind of girl, okay? These sequels tend to be world expanding, meaning instead of sticking to a core class of characters and looking to develop them as the focus of a sequel, genre sequels tend to focus on a location or a main antagonist or protagonist as an anchor character that serves as the connective tissue between sequels, all while rotating new characters into the mix for each new installment. The same goes for the adventure mystery genre, the Alex Cross adaptation, the Sherlock Holmes films, or the more modern version of the genre being Knives Out. Here, you follow an anchor character, in these cases, a detective, as they use their expertise to dive into new adventures with new suspects and puzzles to solve. While this might seem formulaic and repetitive on paper, in my opinion, it works out. A big part of making a sequel is simply understanding what's expandable. In the horror genre, for example, it's definitely not the characters, but instead it's expanding on the lore and finding new, creative ways to have that original threat continue to come back and shock and scare people. For the mystery genre, it's presenting your world-class detective with an even wilder, crazier web to unravel. Another very obvious genre sequel that I haven't been talking about is the superhero sequel. Superhero films are rarely treated as standalone films, mostly because the comic book genre by nature is iterative and designed for rewinds and resets to accommodate different writers and different stories to be told over decades. And obviously, that infinite nature attracts production companies to the genre. No one questions the narrative merit of a superhero film. And if for whatever reason, it's clear that the story doesn't need a sequel, they'll just put someone else in the mantle instead to keep it going. This is because the characters, while sure, they all have their unique backstories and motivations, are more than just characters. They're vessels to carry what, in my opinion, is most important in a comic book movie. And it's not the superhero, it's the themes of the story. Superman's innate goodness, Batman's fight for justice, Spider-Man's constant struggle to do what's right. In a lot of ways, this is what protects that genre from dying out, because the qualities that these characters stand for are something that I don't think we'll ever stop looking for within film. In the horror, mystery, and superhero genre, there's an understanding that this story is temporary. There has to be a final fight or final discovery to end it all so that the larger themes can prevail. Whether that theme is the evil of Michael Myers or the sacrifice of an American hero. So while these three categories don't perfectly capture every single sequel ever, it has given us a lot to consider. So, with all this in mind, what does this mean we should do when we inevitably have to make a sequel? Keep in mind, this is not a perfect science, this is just my opinion. Number one, use time travel. Yes. No, I'm joking. I'd say the most important thing to start off with is identifying what's expandable from the original film. Is it a genre sequel, where instead of focusing on a core group of characters that you'll follow throughout the sequel, will you instead focus on the concept, or the location, or an anchor character to lead audiences through the world of the film? Or, let's be real, is it a forced reunion sequel? Before Sunset takes the exact same plot of the exact same two people on a walk 14 years after the original, but it captures you in the tension of an unexpected reunion between two strangers you saw fall in love 14 years earlier. The answer of what's left of their brief but really passionate and meaningful relationship is what keeps audiences engaged for a sequel. That's a film that absolutely needs its original cast back together, but not for the sake of nostalgia, but for the sake of completing an otherwise unfulfilled love story. Guardians 2 is my favorite MCU film, hands down, and it's because it's able to expand on the first film's themes of found family in a way that brings its core group together even closer. And sure, sometimes figuring out what's expandable isn't always obvious. Not every movie ends with a cliffhanger that's just shouting at you what to do next. Alien ends with the alien being blasted off into space, presumably dead, as Ripley descends back onto Earth. Scream ends with not only the most recent string of murder solved, but the murder from the year before also solved. Case closed. These films had to go back to the original to find features to expand upon. Identifying what's expandable not only legitimizes your sequel to skeptics, but also gives the franchise more momentum, making it feel more fulfilling and energized for viewers. 2. Nostalgia is necessary, but in moderation. Most notably for huge blockbusters, I can't say that callbacks and references aren't one of the most enjoyable parts of a franchise or sequel. So by all means, make the callback. But your entire film cannot be nostalgia porn. Whether that's spending way too much time on the buildup of assembling the original cast, or dropping in cameos every other scene. Everyone can feel when the pandering's going too far, so keep an eye out on it. 3. Be ready to change and even subvert expectations. After you've established what's expandable, you now have to look at what you're willing to let go of. Whether it's by introducing a new set of characters that complicate the goals of your protagonist, or by stripping your main character of everything they had in the first movie. Make this return to the world of your story worth watching by going big. If it's a horror, accept that the original cast can't all make it to the final scene. If it's a mystery, make it personal this time. If it's a comedy, I'm actually not sure that you guys have rules, so honestly do what you want. But I know I can't watch Eddie Murphy play every single member of a farting family for another 90 minutes. With that being said, the liberties that you take to differentiate yourselves from the first film should be used sparingly. Because when it comes down to it, unexpectedly subverting expectations or just surprising your audience for the sake of shock value alone doesn't automatically make for a good sequel. One of my favorite parts of the admittedly flawed Kill Bill Volume 2 is the reveal of David Carradine's Bill. From the past film, we'd gotten kind of a fragmented view through flashbacks and other means of the titular villain being Bill. He's a larger-than-life assassin boss that's clearly an absolute monster. But when we finally get to meet him within, I think, about the last hour of the film, he possesses a peacefulness and normalness that's even more alarming when you realize that the bride's unborn daughter has been blissfully being raised by him for the past few years. That reveal makes Bill an even more menacing character that completely subverted my expectation to see an aggressive and loud and seethingly evil villain that I'd heard about from the first film. And while this subversion of my expectation doesn't undermine anything from the first film, it's clear that Tarantino sacrificed what we were anticipating to be the loudest, goriest, and bloodiest fight of them all, a showdown with the final boss being Bill. But instead of making it this balls-to-the-wall, multi-part finale showdown, he makes it this dialogue-rich mental battle that concludes with a quiet, 5-point palm exploding heart technique. But in general, the opportunity to revisit a widely loved and celebrated film is nothing to scoff at. But the stress to follow up an unexpected success is overwhelming, along with the fear of letting people down. Some might say, I can relate. If you're here, it's probably because you saw the unexpectedly successful Community versus The Office video I made over a year ago that the algorithm just swept up for some reason a few weeks ago. And just like James Cameron, I too wondered how to expand my Pandora. Genuinely, after one video, I felt kind of stunned that so many people had seen what I'd made, and I was really unsure of what to do next. It felt a little tacky to immediately follow up with another Community video, and none of my other ideas felt good enough to follow up what other people seemed to have liked. As ridiculous as it is, like it's just a YouTube video, but I was just really nervous to follow it up, and it just kind of drained all the typical excitement that I have when writing for a video. I got a lot of advice to stick to what was clearly working, which was the TV trope analysis, focusing on The Office and Community as two properties that have really dedicated and active fan bases. And while it's clear I love both of those shows, and I have every intention of making more videos, namely about Community, it might not be stuff y'all want to hear from me, but it's what I have to say. Nevertheless, as scary as it is, thinking about like how many people said they were excited to see more sitcom analysis, I don't think that's what this channel is for me. And like, I know saying this isn't like going to ruin a life. Like, I'm not like breaking the news to anyone, you know? But I think it was something that I needed to say. Like, I needed to get off my chest. Again, it's kind of melodramatic to like have a video about how follow-ups are so difficult. And like, it's my follow-up after my success. Like, no, I don't mean it like that, but it really was something that sparked interest for me because I was like, wow, I feel really stressed out and I just had one video that did kind of well. How do people feel when they make like low budget movies that have multi-million-dollar success and everyone's like, do the same thing again? Like, it's stressful. I would know. I'm an artist. So with that, I'm excited for this space to continue to be me just talking about things I like in film and TV without getting too caught up in like, can I make it that big again? You know? I do want to remember that this is like just a fun space that I have. And I will forever be excited to share it with anyone who's willing to join me. So with that, sequels suck, sometimes. Thanks, and I'll see you next time.